Good day, my friends. First, a word of gratitude to David and the ISR for including me in this conference on evangelicalism in Latin America. It is an honor and is promising to have the ISR and Baylor provide this important opportunity for critical reflection regarding our evangelical traditions in our continent. Let's begin. I always find myself slightly confused and puzzled by the term evangelicalism connected to Latin America. For Latin America and the Spanish speaking Caribbean, I prefer the term evangélicos. Moreover, given the experiences of Pentecostality in our continent and islands, many of which of this without connection to Azusa or other Pentecostal traditions, I would add charismáticos and provide the following working definition. Evangélicos charismáticos is the term used by Latin American and Spanish Caribbean people to distinguish themselves from Roman and charismatic Catholics. An evangelico is usually a person who belongs to a Protestant or Pentecostal community, reads and lives the scriptures, keeps a relatively strong countercultural position in social and religious issues, nurtures a spiritual discipline of prayer, Bible study, and reflection, a pious discipline, tries to be compassionate, and guides his life by spiritual experiences attributed to the Holy Spirit. More recent studies show that evangelicos and evangelicas, if poor, they develop new economic practices that contribute to a more stable household. And if middle class, they have an inclination towards gaining some level of economic prosperity, which results in a more tolerant attitude towards religious and social diversity. I have always been intrigued by el avivamiento del 33, the revival of 1933 in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Puerto Rico. In recent years, however, with the political and economic collapse of the government, the increasing governmental corruption woven with two devastating hurricanes, Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, and the financial crisis, local disciples' congregations, aggravated by the pandemic experience, with a resulting migration of Puerto Ricans to the United States, it truly ignites my curiosity to revisit the story of the avivamiento of 33. The storytellers of the avivamiento seem to carry a common tune. This is the birth of a national church. Following good historical methodology, the storytellers provide the context from which the avivamiento emerged. One slight exception in the telling of the story is Daisy Machado's chapter El Gran Avivamiento del 33 in Futuring Our Past, Explorations in the Theology of Tradition, where Machado names continuities and discontinuities with the broader tradition of the disciples of Christ in the United States. Yet, the story is framed as the legitimate birth of the Puerto Rican disciples of Christ. What follows is a very brief synthesis of the work I'm completing for the essay, and I hope it ignites curiosity in what does it mean to be evangélico, charismático in Puerto Rico. The context. Between 1898 and 1930, the United States had imposed a new process of colonization in the island. English was taught and required in the very fragile educational system, and the expansion of Protestantism was supported as an ideological corollary to the colonial project. The military government created the conditions to acquire large extensions of land, displacing the Puerto Rican landowners and merchants. In 1928, Hurricane San Felipe hits the island, accelerating in Puerto Rico the arrival of the Great Depression. And in 1932, Hurricane San Ciprian pounds the island with destruction and devastation. The 30s witnessed two political responses from elite Puerto Ricans: the grounding of the national political party, el Partido Nacionalista, and by the end of the 1930s, the creation of the Democratic Popular Party, led by Luis Muñoz Marín. Muñoz Marín is considered by many el padre de la patria, the founding father of the nation. By others, el padre de la colonia, the founding father of the colony. At the popular level, Puerto Ricans were hungry, landless, and exploited. Anomy was the norm in Puerto Rico immediately after San Ciprian. The avalanche of colonialism and the unexpected devastation of the hurricanes left the Puerto Rican people in limbo. When the social tapestry of a people is tackled, religion becomes a critical human agency, but it can be as ambiguous as the context that generates its effervescence. The economic crisis had already created problems with keeping disciples missionaries in Puerto Rico. Consequently, the Board of Mission left two missionaries in charge of the emerging but weakened disciples congregation: Reverend Veer C. Carpenter and Reverend C. Manley Morton. They represent the missionaries in the context for disciples' identity in Puerto Rico. On the national side, you have a list of lay leaders and pastors who were engaged in prayer, Bible study, devotion to seek the Spirit of God during this very difficult period. The lay leaders met in the local congregation in Calle Comerío, Bayamón. Yet, it was not long before the avivamiento spread like wildfire to other disciples' churches in the north central region of the island, originally assigned by the mission committee to the disciples of Christ. The avivamiento created an unexpected growth. Reports to the Disciples Mission Board show that by 1932, the disciples had no more than 1,780 members. By 1947, the members had grown to 5,000. Yet, the storytellers emphasize the development or the creation of the liturgia criolla. This liturgia criolla, or autochthonous liturgy, what grew out of the avivamiento and the radical decision to claim the local congregations which stood by the charismatic experience as self-supporting. This is what the storytellers emphasize: the liturgia criolla and the claim for a self-supporting church as the first step towards a national church. Worship became one of the loci of contestation for disciples' identity in Puerto Rico. For example, the missionaries ordered that the local congregations sponsoring worship services with charismatic experiences be locked. Local leaders sought proper counsel and brought to the federal courts in Puerto Rico the protection of freedom of assembly and worship, to which the U.S. judge quickly executed an order for congregations to be opened. One of the paradoxical consequences is that while the federal courts were placed in Puerto Rico for the protection of the U.S. interest and colonial project, they ended securing a religious space for the emerging Puerto Rican disciples and their avivamiento. This liturgia criolla has marked the discontinuity with the U.S. Protestant missionary project and the beginning of a self-supporting Puerto Rican disciples of Christ. I agree with my Puerto Rican and Latina scholars in their cultural and religious interpretation of the avivamiento. I do argue that the liturgia criolla, the abundance of creative hymnody with Puerto Rican musical instruments and rhythms, is too narrowly interpreted to be claimed as unique to the disciples of Christ. I also argue that while the liturgia criolla is a sign of discontinuity with U.S. disciples of Christ worship and mission structure, even with subsequent assemblies illustrating the process of self-support, 1948, 1954, so on, and the disciples, and yet the disciples continue to be a dependent church structure. In other words, the disciples of Christ, although claiming self-support, are still dependent on the disciples of Christ in the United States. Just as the creation of the Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, Luis Muñoz Marin's project continues to exist as a colonial enclave with a freedom facade. Yet, allow me to offer one example of the liturgia criolla that allows the correlation between Roman Catholic imagery and the avivamiento. In a way, I'm also challenging the assumption that the avivamiento is somehow uniquely Puerto Rican and evangelical. And I want to put in your hands, put to your consideration the Roman Catholic imagery found in some of the hymns. Ramón Moncho Diaz was a local leader in one of the churches in Bayamón, carrying in his body the wounds of a terrible disease. Moncho was one of the most prolific hymn writers of the avivamiento. For the sake of time, I will only include selected strophes from many of his hymns. Yet I want you to note the emphasis on Christ's suffering in the cross. Come to Jesus' feet, sinner. Today he wants to save you from pain. See, he died for you in the cross, and your sin is redeemed. The cup of pain he suffered for you and I to cleanse our sins. He shed his blood. There, a sweet voice that died was heard, that died. There his spirit, Jesus, entrusted to his Father. Later the earth trembled. The veil in half was broken. The wind preached. Darkness inhabited the world, and there was great fear. In another hymn, Moncho preaches a gospel highlighting the cross. If you're overwhelmed, if you're tired, you suffer punishment for your rebellion. Decide today to look at Calvary, at the cross, and you will experience relief from your pain. Only the late Reverend Lucas Torres, recognizes that muchos de sus temas procuraron interpretar la tragedia del Calvario. Many of his hymns seek to interpret the tragedy of Calvary. Other storytellers name the liturgia criolla, but do not address that which, at least for me, seems very obvious. In a context of so much suffering, Moncho rediscovers the crucifix as an evangélico carismático. Can the disciples claim to be a national church in a colonial context, or is there resurrection without a cross? I agree with my scholarly colleagues that the avivamiento del 33 represents a discontinuity with disciples' mission board theology and church polity, and a step towards a Puerto Rican disciples of Christ identity. Una identidad carismática y evangélica, a charismatic and evangelical identity. And that such identity is best embodied in the liturgia criolla. However, since then, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Puerto Rico has become a national church, but certainly not a self-supporting church. This is where I find the intersection between Luis Muñoz Marin's project for the Estado Libre Asociado, the free associated state, which is fully integrated into the political and economic system of the United States, and the Puerto Rican Disciples of Christ. The contradiction inherent to the colonized are evident in short and long-term consequences. For example, the Puerto Rican disciples were never self-supporting, just as the Puerto Rican state was never self-supporting. Funds continue to flow from the disciples of Christ in Puerto Rico, from the disciples of Christ in the United States to the Puerto Rican disciples of Christ, just as the Puerto Rican state has been able to get funding from the United States for long time until this particular time of economic collapse. The change is best characterized by the shift from mercantilism to dependent capitalism. And as the churches continue to grow, there was a need to buy property, a need for maintaining buildings, to keep certain programs going. And though the nationals participated in these projects, most of the funds continued to be dependent on the mission board and its later itinerances. Moreover, the financial reports of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Puerto Rico show an outstanding debt to the Board of Church Extension of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the US and Canada that ranges between $10 to $13 million. This is excluding loans to para-ecclesial organizations affiliated to the Puerto Rican Disciples of Christ. With the migration of Puerto Rican professionals to the United States today, many of the congregations are facing very difficult financial constraints, limiting their local mission. In addition, from a liturgia criolla perspective, though the disciples of Christ continue to use and celebrate the hymnody of the Avivamiento del 33, in a non-systematic survey, I discovered that the youth of Puerto Rican disciples pierden su memoria, are losing their disciples' memory, as the Protestant or evangelical Christian music market in Spanish is taking over our churches. Moncho's powerful imagery and interpretation of the Calvary, of Jesus' death, of suffering, is in deep contrast with the imagery of an empty cross, a critical evangelical symbol for Latin American and Caribbean evangelicos and charismáticos. Perhaps disciples in Puerto Rico need a new avivamiento, one that awakens our memories and launches us to take the step not taken, the embodiment of a national church that advocates for the poor of our island, the poor of our island, the protection of our fauna and flora, and a rediscovery of a liturgia criolla with images and poetry that reminds us that resurrection without the cross is a lie. Thank you.